Relationship between human development and natural resources has always been about balance, but for too long we treated it as a one-way transaction. We extracted, we built, we developed, and we assumed the environment would simply absorb the impact. But regulations and permitting processes have evolved to recognize a fundamental truth. We don't exist separate from our ecosystems. We exist within them. Every engineering project, whether it's a bridge, a pipeline, a housing development, or a manufacturing facility, intersects with natural systems. And that's where environmental permitting comes in. It's not just about bureaucratic red tape. It's the framework that ensures coexistence. Before we break ground, we need to understand what's already there. Are we building in wetlands that filter our water and prevent flooding? Are we disrupting wildlife corridors that species depend on for survival? Are we contaminating groundwater that communities rely on? The permitting process forces us to ask these questions upfront, to conduct environmental impact assessments, to consider alternatives, and to design mitigation strategies. It's about making sure that when we build something for human benefit, we're not destroying the very resources that sustain us.
Let's talk about what this actually means when you're working on a project. You've got your design, you're ready to start construction, but before anything happens, you need permits. Federal permits, state permits, and sometimes local permits. The Clean Water Act requires permits if your work impacts wetlands or waterways. The Endangered Species Act requires consultation if threatened or endangered species might be present. And the National Environmental Policy Act requires environmental assessments for major federal actions. But here's the thing. These aren't obstacles, they're guardrails. They make sure we account for resources that may not have a price tag in a traditional economic analysis, but carry immense value. When you have to delineate wetlands, you're forced to understand the site's hydrology, soil composition, and ecological functions those wetlands provide. When you apply for an air quality permit, you're quantifying emissions and demonstrating how you'll stay within limits designed to protect public health. And when you conduct cultural resource surveys, you're recognizing that the land has history and significance beyond its development potential. Yes, this process adds time to a project. Yes, it requires expertise and coordination. But ultimately, it leads to better projects that can operate long-term without damaging the resources they depend on or the communities they affect.
Now, I've heard the frustration from engineers and developers who feel like permitting slows everything down, and I understand that pressure to deliver projects quickly and stay on budget. But consider what happens without these regulations. We've seen it throughout history. Rivers that caught fire because of chemical pollution, entire fisheries collapsed because of overharvesting and habitat destruction, communities with poisoned water supplies because industrial waste wasn't properly managed. Regulations exist because the cost of not having them is catastrophic. And modern permitting actually creates opportunities for innovation. When you can't just discharge wastewater into a river, you develop treatment systems and closed-loop processes. When you can't build directly on sensitive habitats, you cluster develop and preserve open space, often creating more valuable projects. When you need to offset unavoidable impacts, you contribute to restoration efforts that improve overall ecosystem health. The key is integration. Environmental considerations shouldn't be an afterthought once engineers' designs are complete. They should be integrated from day one. Work with environmental scientists during site selection. Incorporate resource protection into your design criteria. Build relationships with regulatory agencies early so you can understand requirements and can design accordingly. This isn't about humans versus nature. It's about designing systems where both can thrive.
So what's the path forward for engineers navigating this landscape? First, education and expertise. You need to understand environmental regulations that apply to your projects, and if you don't have that expertise in-house, you bring in specialists. Second, proactive engagement. Don't wait until you finalize designs to start the permitting conversation. Meet with agencies early, understand their concerns and feedback that can shape your approach. Third, documentation and transparency. Regulators need to see that you've done your due diligence, that you've considered impacts, that you're implementing best practices. Good documentation makes permitting smoother. Fourth, embrace adaptive management. Sometimes we don't know exactly how a project will affect resources until it's operational. Build in monitoring and be prepared to adjust based on what you learned. And finally, recognize that we're stewards, not just builders. Every project we engineer exists in relationship with air, water, soil, and living communities. Regulations and permits are society's way of saying that those relationships matter, that future generations deserve clean water and healthy ecosystems just as much as we do. When we approach permitting not as a hurdle to overcome, but as a tool for responsible coexistence, we become better engineers. We create infrastructure that lasts, that serves communities without destroying the natural capital they depend on. That's not a constraint on engineering, that's engineering at its best.